Hi, Mike Shelley here. I finally figured out how to make tartine style bread, and I'm gonna show you step by step today how to get it to rise so that it's really tangy on the inside and has a really nice crust on the outside. First of all, let's add 100 grams of the starter to the bowl, and that consists of 25 grams of the original starter that I had in my fridge, plus 25 grams of bread flour, plus 25 grams of whole wheat flour, plus 50 grams of water. And I let it ferment for 5 hours to make sure the fermentation is at its peak to get a lot of rise in the bread later on. Next up is 450 grams of bread flour. I use an organic brand from San Francisco's Rainbow Groceries, but in reality, any type of bread flour should be fine. Then comes 50 grams of whole wheat flour, and that's just to add more natural yeast to the mix. The final bread will be a white sourdough, and you won't even taste the 10% whole wheat that's in there. Then add 350 grams of lukewarm water, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and start the kneading process. Just go in with your hands that you've washed previously, of course, and try to hydrate all the flour that's in the bowl evenly. And no doubt there's this one sticky mess that dough is gonna stick to your fingers, but don't freak out. We're gonna peel that off later. The goal is just to get it all evenly into the flour and to not have any major lumps of flour hanging around. If stuff is sticking to the side of the bowl, use something flexible like a plastic spatula to scrape it off and get it into the main dough. After you've done that for a minute or so, you'll notice the dough is going to be a lot smoother and incredibly sticky. So just try to wrap it up into one giant lump and then clean off your fingers by using your other hand and just I'm afraid there's no better way to just wipe it off and the best that you can. And some it's gonna be sticking to your hand nevertheless, but that's okay. Just wash your hands afterwards. Then cover up the bowl with plastic wrap to prevent the dough from drying out. Be careful when you apply it and remove it later because we're going to do that a couple of times and reuse it. The dough should now be stored for 20 minutes in a warm place, about 80 degrees. But if you live in a place like San Francisco, which hardly gets 80 degrees, my solution to this problem was to put it on top of the stove while keeping the oven door open and set the oven to 350 degrees for a couple of minutes until it warms up. After about 20 minutes, check out the dough. It should have risen to about twice the original size, be really smooth, so we can move on to the salting phase. Believe it or not, bread needs a lot of salt, otherwise it will taste totally bland. So we're going to add 20 grams of water and 10 grams of salt. I use sea salt, but it doesn't really matter what kind of salt it is because we're going by weight and not by volume. Salt is salt, it's all the same. Now go ahead and try to dissolve the entire amount in that little bit of water. It won't dissolve all the way, but that's fine. Pour it over the dough and dimple it. Make sure it penetrates the entire amount of dough. Scrape around. Make sure that all the dough is removed from the smooth surface of the bowl. Use the scraper if needed. So at this point in time, you gotta make sure you have a very smooth lump of dough that we're going forward to knead. Now this is an absolutely critical phase in the bread making process. It will determine whether you're gonna end up with some tough to eat flatbread or with a tangy sourdough that's risen quite a bit. So what you want to do is add some air into the dough, and you're going to do that by slamming it around and mashing it against the wall of the bowl. And you can do that for about 5 minutes or so until you end up with a very smooth surface dough. All the remaining lumps will have disappeared, and you'll encounter a new kind of stickiness that you can counter by wetting your hands with a bowl of water that you best keep nearby. So when you're done, and please don't cut this part short, because if you do, the bread won't rise. Make sure it's nice and smooth. Put the foil back on and put it back in a warm place for 20 minutes. After that, take a look. The dough is a lot smoother now, although there's still some structure on the surface. Wet your hand with a little bit of water, and if the dough is sticking to the side of the bowl, try to separate it from the wall. It still needs to get a lot airier, so what we're going to do is a series of so-called stretch and fold exercises. Draw up the dough on the side, stretch it as far as it goes without tearing it, and then slowly put it back onto itself. Do that in 90-degree angle 4 times. Rotate the bowl accordingly, and then put the bowl back into the warm place for another rest period of 20 minutes. Repeat these stretch and fold exercises once or twice with rest times in between, and if the dough structure is really smooth, then it's time to move on to so-called curl folds, where we separate the dough from the bowl wall again and lift it up just to let it fall onto itself. If you don't have enough water on your hands, the dough is going to stick to them and it's going to be difficult to do those curl folds. Don't go overboard with the water on your hands though, because if it's too much, then the dough is going to get too watery and even more sticky and harder to handle. Just remove the dough from your hands if it's too much and put a little bit of water in there. Any bubbles that you see on the surface, just pop them and continue your curl folds in 90-degree angles 4 times. Rotate the bowl and then cover it up for another rest time. Repeat those curl folds once or twice, and when the dough is really smooth and not sticking to the wall anymore, it's time to shape it on a wooden board that we're going to be covering with a little bit of flour. Any type of flour is fine. With all of the previous stretch and fold and curl fold exercises, the dough surface will be so smooth that it will fall out of the bowl if we just plop it onto the surface, and it won't stick to the wood because we covered it with flour. Notice how the downside of the dough is now floured, where the upside is not, and it's going to be sticky. So we're going to flip it around to get some flour on the upside as well. It's going to stick to the board maybe a little bit depending on the dough structure, but if you have a metal spatula, you can usually get it off cleanly and flip it. Now the following technique is really crucial in getting your bread into a shape that will allow it to rise vertically. So it will determine whether you'll end up with some pizza flatbread or a real sourdough high rise. Your lead hand holds the spatula on the side while your other hand supports the dough from the bottom. I'm right-handed, so I hold the spatula with my right hand and then move it upwards in a counterclockwise fashion while pushing down, at the same time pushing up with my left hand to hold the dough in place. See how that compresses the dough and pushes it towards a rounder shape? Do that a couple of times until you reach the end of the board. If you're not done yet, just turn the board around and start again. Continue doing that until it's perfectly round. It's not only for aesthetic reasons, but it also provides structure in the dough that allows it to rise vertically. I didn't get this right with the first couple of loaves I made, and it didn't really rise, and I was wondering what was going on. But that technique really helps putting it into the desired shape. Now spread some flour on the top of the loaf and cover it up. Let it rest for 20 minutes, and then we'll put it into the proofing basket. Now it's just a regular bowl made of bamboo in my case, with some cotton lining so that the dough can lie in there and breathe, I guess. So you actually need to put flour on there to prevent the dough from sticking to the lining. And what works best, and this is really crucial, is rice flour because it's much more fine-grained than regular flour. It fills the little holes in the lining and definitely helps to prevent the dough from sticking, because the last thing you want is the dough sticking to this lining and you can't then dump it into the Dutch oven later on when it's time to bake it. Now back to our dough, which has rested for 15 or 20 minutes under the plastic wrap, and the floured side is still up, so we want to flip it around one more time to get the unfloured side to the top. We need to be careful here and use our metal spatula in order to prevent the dough from ripping. Now before we place the dough in the basket, we fold it 4 times. Put a little flour on your hands to prevent it from sticking, and then tuck it in from both sides, from left and from the right, and also from the bottom, just like an envelope. And it can be kind of challenging, but just be patient. And for the last tuck, just wrap the upside all the way around and make a little burrito roll there. Flip it around one more time and dump it into the proofing basket. We're on the home stretch now. Sprinkle some flour on top, which is important because later on we're gonna bake it and the upside is gonna lie down and otherwise stick to the oven. Let's put that plastic wrap on one more time and tighten it with a rubber band, and then wrap everything into a giant trash bag because we're going to put it into the fridge, and fridges typically take the moisture out of the dough, so we want to make sure nothing escapes from that basket during the 12 hours that it's going to be resting in the fridge, while the dough will be fermenting slowly and creating that nice sourdough taste. On the next day, or whenever 12 hours are over, you can take the dough out of the fridge, maybe leave it at room temperature for 2 to 3 hours if you want to, and sprinkle some flour on top. For bread baking, I use a cast iron Dutch oven, which comes in a main pan and a lid. And usually you use the pan at the bottom and put the lid on top. But for bread baking, it's actually beneficial to put the lid at the bottom because it's so flat and you can dump the dough in there without burning yourself, and then put the bottom on top, which looks kind of weird but works in the same way, which is important for the bread to rise in the first couple of minutes because you're providing an ultra hot oven within your oven. Preheat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which takes about half an hour. Be generous about that because you want the oven to be absolutely hot even if you open the door. Also make sure that the Dutch oven is being placed in the oven during that preheat phase. We want it to be scorching hot when we pour the dough in. After half an hour, it's go time when we take the hot lid out of the oven and dump the dough from the basket onto the pan. And since I was fiddling with the video camera and the dough at the same time, I almost messed it up, but a little wiggle distributed it evenly in the pan. But always remember to wear your oven mitts, of course, otherwise you severely burn your hands. Now, the dough needs to be cut on top so that it can expand upwards. This is very important, and you need either a very sharp knife to cut about 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep into the dough in a cross shape. And make sure to work fast because we don't want the lid to cool down. Put it back in the oven and put the other part of the Dutch oven on top. After 25 minutes at 500 Fahrenheit, it's time to remove the lid. You can see that the loaf has risen quite a bit, but it's not brown on the surface yet. So removing the lid will do exactly that. But make sure to reduce the temperature to 450 for the remaining 20 minutes of baking time. After another 20 minutes, remove the loaf from the oven, and it should be easy to get it out of the pan because we floured it and the pan has been seasoned. Put the loaf down on a cooling rack and let it cool for at least an hour. I know it might be tempting to cut right into it, but believe me, it's better if you wait because that'll preserve the integrity of the inside and improve the quality. And there you have it. Hope this was helpful. Enjoy.